Still the study clock ticked as my daughter slid the power of attorney across my desk and called it for my own good. As I lifted the pen, I steadied my hand, choosing peace over the argument I could feel coming. While that ticking grew louder, it echoed every year I'd stayed silent to keep my family intact. The same sound followed the moment I realized control was being taken, not offered. That's when I understood the betrayal wasn't legal, it was personal, wrapped in a smile. Still listening to the clock, I decided I wouldn't fight loudly. I'd reclaim my life quietly and permanently. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the house feels more like a sanctuary than a home. Elliot sat in his favorite armchair by the window, the late afternoon sunlight casting soft shadows across the polished wood floor. The faint hum of traffic in the distance was the only sound that broke the silence. The weight of the years had started to settle deeper in his bones, but in moments like this, with the familiar smell of old books and leather around him, he felt at peace. Then the door to the study creaked open, and Rachel walked in, a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her smile was as polished as ever, but there was something about the way she carried herself that sent a chill through the room. "Dad, I need you to sign something," she said, her voice smooth but with an edge of something Elliot couldn't quite place. She handed him the form, a power of attorney document. "It's for your own good," she continued, her tone deceptively sweet. "This way, I can handle things for you if you ever can't take care of them yourself. Your finances, health care, all of it." Elliot looked down at the form. The words blurred slightly in front of him. A wave of discomfort washed over him. It was the kind of thing he'd been dreading for some time, his growing dependence on others, the slow erosion of his autonomy. But he couldn't afford to make waves. Not now. Not with Drew looking to Rachel for guidance on every little thing. Rachel's eyes watched him, waiting for his response. There was no urgency in her voice, but the undercurrent was clear. "It's really for the best, Elliot. We just want to make sure you're taken care of," she added, her eyes narrowing slightly as she spoke, as if to emphasize how important it was. He hesitated. There was a gnawing feeling in his gut, a whisper telling him that something was off, but the years of keeping peace in his family had taught him to ignore it. The last thing he wanted was to stir the pot. Rachel had always been controlling, but Drew needed her, and by extension, he needed to keep her happy. With a deep breath, Elliot took the pen from her hand, his fingers cold against the paper. He signed the document, the sharp click of the pen filling the space between them. Rachel's smile widened, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Thanks, old man," she said, her voice almost a whisper though her tone was biting. The way she said it, casual, dismissive, stung more than Elliot cared to admit. She turned and walked out, leaving Elliot with a sinking feeling that he couldn't quite shake. "Old man," she had called him. The words had been sharp, laced with something cruel, as if she was reminding him of his age, of his diminishing relevance. Drew had been in the kitchen, blissfully unaware of the tension in the room. He came in now, looking between his father and the signed document in Elliot's hand. "What's this about, Dad?" Drew asked, his tone light, the way he always was when he tried to smooth things over. "Rachel's just trying to help, you know. It's not like you'll need it any time soon. She's just looking out for you." Elliot looked at his son, the sincerity in Drew's eyes and the uncomfortable truth settled in his chest. Drew couldn't see it. He was too wrapped up in Rachel's vision of their future, too willing to let her take the reins. "I know," Elliot said, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. He forced a smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's fine." But as Drew left the room, Elliot's gaze lingered on the document. His mind raced, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "For your own good," she had said. "I'll handle everything for you." Later that night, long after Drew had gone to bed, Elliot sat in the study, the house now bathed in moonlight. He replayed the afternoon over and over in his mind. The way Rachel had smirked when she handed him the paper, the way she had belittled him with that simple, old man. He thought about the power she now had over him, his finances, his health care. He had given it to her willingly, signed it like a fool, but that sick feeling in his stomach wouldn't go away. His hands clenched, the edges of the paper still in his grip, as if it could somehow hold the key to everything he was feeling. Had he just been manipulated into handing over control? Or was he just being paranoid, too sensitive to the subtle shifts in his world? One thing was certain, this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. And Rachel, she wasn't done, not by a long shot. The next few days were a blur of unsettling quiet. Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something that he couldn't quite place. Every time he walked into his study, his gaze fell on the signed power of attorney document, now sitting on his desk like an ominous reminder of what he'd just handed over. It gnawed at him, this feeling of unease. It wasn't just that he'd signed the form. It was that he'd done it without truly understanding the consequences. That simple gesture of trust, extended to Rachel with the belief that she was only trying to help, suddenly felt like a betrayal of his own instincts. Was this really for his good, or had he just signed away his independence without realizing it? He couldn't rest until he got some clarity. His thoughts raced as he picked up the phone, dialing Max's number. Max, his lawyer for over 20 years, answered on the second ring. "Elliot, what's up?" "I need to talk to you," Elliot said, his voice tight. "About that power of attorney I signed for Rachel." There was a long pause before Max responded. "I figured you might call. What's on your mind?" "I don't know, something doesn't feel right. I agreed to it, but now I'm wondering what I've really done." Max's voice was steady, almost too calm. "Well, let's look at it. You've just given Rachel control over your financial matters, your healthcare decisions, everything, really. That means if you become incapacitated or unable to make decisions, she's the one calling the shots." Elliot's grip tightened around the phone, his throat dry. Everything. He had signed away everything. "I trusted her," Elliot muttered, more to himself than to Max. "I thought she was just helping." Max's tone sharpened slightly. "That's the problem. Rachel's been playing you, Elliot. This isn't about helping you, it's about taking control. If you're not careful, she could start making decisions without your input, and once she has control, it's hard to get it back." Elliot leaned back in his chair, the weight of Max's words sinking in. "What can I do?" Max paused. "First thing, you need to look into legal protections, update your will, change the deed on the house if necessary. You need to make sure you've got safeguards in place. You don't want to wait until it's too late." The conversation left Elliot feeling cold, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He had always been in control of his life, every decision, every direction. And now it felt like he was being swept along, powerless in the wake of someone else's ambitions. He hung up the phone, his mind spinning with possibilities. As he stared at the documents on his desk, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. It was Rachel, walking into the study with an air of quiet confidence. She moved about the room as though she had always belonged there, making small adjustments, straightening a picture frame, organizing his papers. "Did you want to discuss the plans for the estate? I've been thinking about the renovations we need to make." Her words were casual, but the underlying message was clear. She was in charge now. Elliot watched her, his stomach twisting. He hadn't agreed to any changes, had he? She was moving things around like she was already the one calling the shots, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "I didn't approve any of this," Elliot said, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. Rachel looked up, feigning surprise. "Oh, I just thought it would be easier for you. You've been so busy. Don't worry, I've got it covered." The dismissive tone, the overbearing confidence, it stung. But what hurt more was the realization that Drew, who had been standing by the door watching, didn't seem to notice any of it. He just stood there, silent, as if it was all perfectly normal. "Dad, she's just trying to make things easier for you," Drew said, stepping forward. His voice was gentle, but there was a faint edge of concern in it. "You should let her do this. It's what's best." Elliot forced a tight smile, but his eyes flickered to Drew, seeing him in a new light. How had he become so passive, so willing to let Rachel take the reins? Was this what he had raised him to be? A man who couldn't see the manipulation right in front of him. "I know," Elliot said quietly, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I know." As Rachel continued to rearrange the papers on his desk, Elliot's mind raced. The nagging doubt that had been there since the moment he signed the document only grew stronger. Was he being too complacent? Had he truly let Rachel take control, or had he been too afraid to confront her? The quiet resolve that had once come so easily to him was fading. He couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. Not anymore. That night, as the house settled into an uneasy silence, Elliot sat alone in his study, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had been too passive, too willing to let others make decisions for him. But not anymore. He would take control again. It was time to make his move. The question was, what would Rachel do when she realized that Elliot wasn't going to sit back and let her win without a fight? Elliot couldn't sit still any longer. The more he thought about Rachel's growing control over everything, the house, the finances, even his health, the more he felt the slow suffocation of it all. He had to act, but not through confrontation. Not yet, at least. He knew Rachel well enough to understand that an open battle would only play into her hands. No, he needed to be smarter than that. The next morning, he dialed Max's number, his hand shaking slightly as he held the phone to his ear. When Max answered, Elliot wasted no time. "I need to reverse the power of attorney I signed. How do I do that?" Max's voice was calm but thoughtful. "It's not going to be easy, Elliot. Once it's in place, reversing it isn't straightforward, but it's possible if you're careful." Elliot's heart rate picked up. "What do I need to do?" "You need to protect yourself first. Start with the family estate. Change the deed. Make sure it's in your name solely. If Rachel's got the power of attorney, she could get access to the house, even sell it without your consent." Max paused. "And you need to update your will. If you haven't already, make sure there are clear instructions for how things should be handled. Without those protections, she'll have all the legal power." Elliot's mind raced. He'd spent years building his life, his wealth, his legacy. He wasn't about to lose it now to someone who thought she could play the game better than he could. He trusted Max completely, and hearing his lawyer's advice solidified something deep inside him. It wasn't just about reversing the power of attorney. It was about taking back control, step by step. "I'll get the documents drawn up," Elliot said, already thinking ahead. "We'll start with the estate." "That's a good first move," Max agreed. "But don't let Rachel know what you're doing. Keep this quiet. The more you move in silence, the better." As Elliot hung up the phone, the plan began to take shape. He'd move fast, but he had to be methodical. No more mistakes. He needed to monitor Rachel's every move, learn her patterns, and start making small, strategic moves to outmaneuver her. He spent the next few days observing, watching her. The way she'd take charge of minor decisions, rearranging furniture, directing contractors, even making decisions about the garden without asking him, wasn't just about efficiency. It was control, pure and simple. He saw it now, every small action that reinforced her dominance. Drew, completely oblivious to the tension building in the house, seemed more distant with each passing day. His mind was consumed with work, leaving Rachel with more freedom to act. Elliot couldn't fault him. Drew had always been the passive one, caught up in the day-to-day. But that meant Rachel had all the room she needed to expand her grip. Elliot's frustration simmered. He wasn't going to wait until it was too late. With Max's help, he began the legal steps to protect what was his. But as he sat in his study late one night, going over the documents, he couldn't shake the nagging fear that Rachel would catch on. It wouldn't be long before she realized he wasn't as docile as he appeared. The clock ticked on, and Elliot knew that the next few weeks would be critical. He had a plan now, a way to regain his power, but the real test was coming. Would Rachel find out before he could act? And if she did, would it be too late to reverse the damage? The tension was building, and Elliot could feel it. A reckoning was coming, one way or another. The night was thick with anticipation as Elliot sat alone in his study, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The legal documents were in front of him, freshly signed, and the deed to the family estate was now solely in his name. Rachel no longer had the power to control his most valuable asset. It was a victory, but it felt far from sweet. It felt more like a quiet storm was beginning to stir. The next morning, he watched from his study window as Rachel arrived, her car gliding up the driveway like it always did. She seemed oblivious, the same confident stride in her step, but Elliot knew, deep down, that today would be different. The subtle shift in the air told him everything he needed to know. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Rachel stormed into the study, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, her expression twisted with disbelief. The moment her eyes landed on the documents on his desk, Elliot saw the change in her. Her face paled. As realization hit, "What have you done?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and betrayal. "You think this is funny, Elliot?" Elliot stood, his posture calm, even though his pulse was quickening. "I'm not trying to be funny, Rachel," he replied, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of something more. "I'm protecting myself. You had control over everything. I had to make sure that couldn't happen." Rachel's eyes burned with fury. "You've played dirty. You think you can just rip this away from me?" She was close now, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. "I've done everything for this family, and this is how you repay me." Elliot's gaze never wavered. "I'm not repaying you, Rachel. I'm taking back what's mine. You've been overstepping. You've been manipulating things for too long. I'm not going to sit by and let you take control of everything." Her face twisted into a sneer. "So this is your solution, betrayal. You think you're going to win by being petty and vindictive." Elliot felt a quiet anger rising, but he kept it in check. His words were calm, but they landed like a punch. "It's not betrayal, it's self-preservation, and don't pretend like you didn't have a hand in pushing me to this point." Rachel's eyes filled with hurt, though it didn't hide the seething anger behind them. "You're sick," she spat, turning on her heel. "You'll regret this." Elliot knew this wasn't over. It couldn't be. But in this moment he felt something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of relief. The shift in power was complete. He had done what he needed to do. But as he stood there, watching Rachel storm out, he couldn't shake the thought that this would only escalate. The tension was too high, too raw. There was no way Rachel would let this slide without retaliating. Drew appeared in the doorway a moment later, his face drawn with concern. He looked between his father and the door Rachel had just slammed behind her. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight. "She's upset, Drew," Elliot replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "She doesn't like the changes I've made. She feels betrayed." Drew frowned. "What changes? Why didn't you tell me about this?" Elliot's heart sank. The cracks in his family were getting wider, and Drew's confusion only made it worse. "I did what I had to do. You'll understand in time." Drew's face tightened. "I don't know if I do," he muttered, retreating without another word. Elliot stood there for a long moment, the weight of the confrontation settling in. He had shifted the power. He had regained control. But at what cost? Would this spark a battle too deep to undo? The storm wasn't over, it had just begun. And now, with Drew starting to pull away, the stakes were even higher. Elliot knew one thing for certain. This was just the first clash in what would be a long and painful war. The phone rang at exactly 10:32 a.m. It was the first sign of the war Rachel had declared. Elliot knew it before he even picked up. He recognized the number. His stomach tightened as he pressed the receiver to his ear. "Elliot," Rachel's voice cut through, smooth and controlled but laced with venom. I've contacted my lawyer. We're filing a legal challenge against your deed changes. You can't just take everything from me." Elliot's grip tightened on the phone. His fingers dug into the receiver, the tension of the past few days building into something sharper, something he could feel in every muscle of his body. "You're wasting your time, Rachel. The deed changes are legally sound. You've lost. There's nothing you can do." Rachel's laugh was cold, unamused. "We'll see about that. You can't just erase me from this. I have rights too." Her words echoed in his mind, the subtle implication that she'd never let go. But Elliot wasn't intimidated. He had done everything right, everything legally. He had the law on his side, and that was something Rachel couldn't manipulate. Not this time. As the call ended, Elliot sat back in his chair, staring at the documents on his desk. The fight was now inevitable. He knew it wouldn't be over quickly, but he'd be damned if he let her take control again. He had drawn a line in the sand, and he wasn't going to let it blur. Later that day, Drew called. His voice was quieter than usual, more hesitant. "Dad, we need to talk." Elliot's heart sank, but he didn't let it show. "About what?" "It's Rachel. She's really upset. She says you're trying to take everything from her. She's really hurt." Elliot closed his eyes for a moment, fighting back the anger that was bubbling inside him. Hurt? She wasn't hurt. She was trying to manipulate Drew. It wasn't about pain, it was about power. "I'm not trying to take anything from her, Drew. I'm just protecting what's mine," Elliot said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've seen what she's been doing, the way she's been running things. She's overstepped." Drew was silent for a long moment. "I know, but can't W. E just talk this through. Can't we find a way to fix things without this getting ugly?" Elliot shook his head. "No, Drew, she doesn't want to fix things, she wants control, and I won't let her have it, not anymore." Drew sighed, frustration clear in his voice. "You're both being so stubborn. I'm caught in the middle." That was the breaking point. Elliot could hear the hurt in his son's voice, the confusion, the way Drew was torn between them. It was too much. He wanted to tell Drew that he understood, that it wasn't about him, but the weight of the situation was too heavy. Too much had already been lost. "I don't want you caught in the middle, son," Elliot said softly. "But this is my life, and I'm not letting her take it from me." As the conversation ended, Elliot was left with the painful reality. Rachel wasn't just fighting for the estate. She was fighting for control over his entire life. And worse, she was trying to manipulate Drew into thinking he was the problem. It was cruel. It was calculated. And it was exactly what Elliot had expected. Max called later, his voice a steady anchor amidst the storm. "Stay focused, Elliot," he advised, his tone firm but understanding. "This isn't just about the estate. It's about more than that. Rachel's trying to take everything from you, but you have the law on your side. Don't lose sight of the bigger picture. This is going to get personal, but you can't back down." Elliot nodded, though Max couldn't see it. He wasn't backing down, not now. Not after everything he had done to get to this point. Rachel was going to fight dirty. She already was. But Elliot couldn't let her win. He would fight this battle until the end, even if it meant losing his son along the way. The weight of that realization settled heavily in his chest, but it was the truth. And it was the price he had to pay for taking control of his life again. As he sat alone in the study, staring at the legal papers in front of him, he couldn't help but wonder, how far would Rachel go to get what she wanted? And how much was he willing to lose to make sure she didn't succeed? The next move was hers, and Elliot had a feeling it would be even more brutal than the last. The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with tension as the judge's words echoed through the space. After reviewing the evidence and the documents provided, the court rules that the power of attorney granted to Rachel is effectively revoked. Mr. Elliot retains full control over his assets and healthcare decisions. Elliot's heart skipped a beat, a mixture of relief and disbelief flooding his chest. It was a win, the first real victory in this battle. He could feel his pulse steadying, the tight grip of anxiety loosening just a little. Rachel had pushed him into a corner, had tried to manipulate him into surrendering everything, but now, finally, the law was on his side. The sense of triumph surged through him, but even as the relief washed over him, a nagging thought lingered. Rachel wouldn't just accept this defeat. Not without a fight. As he left the courtroom, Max walked beside him, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp. "It's a good first step," Max said, his voice low. "But this isn't over. She'll retaliate, and when she does, it'll be harder to predict." Elliot nodded, trying to keep the weight of the moment from crushing him. "I know, but it feels like something's shifting, at least for now." Max glanced at him. "Stay focused. This is where it gets dangerous. You've exposed her and she's going to double down." And sure enough, Elliot didn't have to wait long. The very next day, Rachel showed her hand. She called Drew, her voice frantic, desperate. Elliot could hear the conversation from his study, Drew's voice quiet, the words clipped, as Rachel attempted to pull him into her corner. "You have to see this, Drew," Rachel pleaded. "Your father's turning against us, trying to take everything. He's doing this to destroy our future, to tear us apart. I need you to stand with me." Elliot could hear Drew's hesitation, his silence speaking louder than anything he could say. He wasn't sure what Rachel was saying to him, but Elliot knew that Rachel wasn't about to let this legal loss slide without trying to pull Drew into her drama. The weight of her manipulation was something Drew had always been blind to, but now Elliot could hear the cracks in the armor. Drew was starting to see it. Later, Drew came to him, his face troubled, the shadows under his eyes deeper than usual. "Dad, I'm trying to understand, but Rachel, she's so upset. She says you're taking everything from her." Elliot sighed, his anger simmering beneath the surface, but he held it back, knowing this was Drew's fault. "Drew, you have to see it for what it is. Rachel's been playing both of us. She's been manipulating everything. This isn't about family, it's about control." Drew shifted uncomfortably, his eyes not meeting his father's. "I don't know, Dad. It's hard, she's always been there, but I see it too. I don't know what to believe anymore." Elliot's heart sank as he saw the confusion in Drew's face. This is the price, he thought bitterly. This is what it costs to do the right thing. As the days passed, Rachel's threats grew more aggressive. She'd go public, she said, with accusations of elder abuse. The words hung in the air like poison. Elliot had seen this coming. She would play every card she had left to make him seem like the villain. But he wasn't afraid of her empty threats. He was in the right, and he wasn't going to back down. Max called that evening, his voice calm but firm. "You're going to face more backlash. Rachel will use anything she can to turn people against you. Be prepared, but don't let it shake you. The truth is on your side." Elliot's grip tightened on the phone. He had done everything by the book, and now he had to stand firm in the face of Rachel's lies. She couldn't win. Not now. Not when everything was finally coming to light. As he ended the call and stared out at the darkening sky, Elliot felt a small flicker of hope. Soon, Drew would have to choose a side. But which one would it be? The tension between father and son was palpable, and Elliot couldn't help but wonder. Would Drew continue to let Rachel pull him in, or would he see the truth before it was too late? And how far would Rachel go to drag them all down with her? Rachel's retaliation came swiftly and publicly, a calculated move designed to paint Elliot as the villain in this family drama. Elliot didn't know what hit him when he saw the first headline flash across his screen. Elliot Hastings, once revered patriarch, accused of stealing from his family. Beneath it, a picture of Rachel, eyes red and face streaked with tears, her voice trembling as she described the cold, calculated betrayal she'd suffered at her father-in-law's hands. She framed herself as the victim, the woman who had given everything to the family, only to be blindsided by the man who'd raised her husband. In her words, Elliot wasn't just a father protecting his legacy. He was a man consumed by greed, trying to rob his own son of his rightful inheritance. The accusations came fast and loud, spreading across social media, picking up speed with every post, every share. But Elliot remained unshaken. He refused to engage in the spectacle. His lawyers had already drafted a response, one that would come through the proper channels, not in the circus of public opinion. He wasn't about to play into Rachel's hands, not this time. He could feel his blood boiling, the desire to lash out to defend himself against the lies. But he held back, focusing instead on what truly mattered, his legal strategy. Max had been clear. Stay low, Elliot. Let her burn out. The more she fights, the more she reveals herself. Max was right, but Elliot could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. The longer Rachel spun her narrative, the more it threatened to chip away at the trust people had in him, especially Drew. Drew had always been the peacemaker, the one who couldn't bear to see anyone suffer. But now, the cracks in his relationship with Rachel were starting to show. Elliot could see it in the way Drew's texts had started to carry a different tone, hesitant, almost apologetic. He wasn't blind to the manipulations anymore. The truth was sinking in bit by bit. Drew had begun questioning Rachel's tactics, and it was clear she was losing him. One night after another of Rachel's public tirades, Drew called Elliot, his voice strained like he was carrying a burden he couldn't quite put down. "Dad, I don't know what to believe anymore. She keeps saying you're trying to take everything from us, that you're being heartless, but I don't know. It's not adding up. I've been thinking, and maybe she's been using me." Elliot felt a mix of relief and sorrow wash over him. He'd been dreading this moment, when Drew would finally see Rachel for who she truly was. "I'm not asking you to choose, son," Elliot said softly, though his words felt like a plea. "But you need to trust your instincts. Rachel's not the person she's been pretending to be." Drew was silent for a long time, the pause stretching out between them like a chasm. Finally, he spoke, quieter than before. "I don't know if I can keep ignoring it. Everything she said, it doesn't feel right." Elliot's heart ached. He knew Drew was torn, and he hated that his son was caught in the middle. But this wasn't just about the estate anymore. This was about control, the control Rachel had tried to seize over their lives. And Elliot would do whatever it took to protect the remnants of his family that still believed in him. Meanwhile, Rachel's desperation grew. The public spectacle wasn't working. People weren't rallying behind her like she had hoped. They were starting to see the cracks in her facade, and Rachel, unable to regain control, spiraled. She became erratic, more volatile with every failed attempt to manipulate the narrative. She lashed out, making empty threats, trying to leverage whatever she could. But it was clear, her power was slipping. Max called that evening, his voice calm but firm. "Elliot, it's time to start taking the necessary steps. Cut her out of your life, legally, emotionally, whatever it takes. She's not going to stop until she has nothing left to hold over you." Elliot knew what Max meant. He had to begin the process of distancing himself from Rachel entirely. But the weight of that decision hung heavy. Cutting Rachel out wouldn't be easy. The emotional toll was already wearing on him, but he couldn't let her drag him any further into her web. He stood by the window, looking out over the estate, the place that had once felt like home, now a battleground. The worst wasn't over yet. As the tension grew, Elliot knew that the fight was far from finished, and Rachel's next move could be the one that truly shattered everything. The confrontation had been a long time coming. Drew stood in the living room, his face tight, the words he'd been holding back for weeks now on the tip of his tongue. Rachel was pacing in front of him, her usual air of control slipping into frustration as she tried to maintain her composure. But Drew wasn't going to let her hide behind that facade anymore. "Why?" His voice was low, but there was an undeniable weight to it. "Why have you been doing this, Rachel? Why have you gone to such lengths to manipulate me and Dad? All this time I've been standing by you, and now I see it. I see what you've been doing." Rachel froze. The last few weeks had been a blur of accusations, threats, and manipulation. She had expected resistance, of course, but not this, not Drew. For the first time, she could see the cracks in the carefully constructed image she'd built. Drew wasn't buying the story anymore, and that realization hit her harder than anything else. "You're making a mistake, Drew," she said, her voice dangerously calm, but the crack in it was unmistakable. "You think you understand, but you don't. This is about us, about our future. Your father's trying to take everything from us and you're just letting him." Drew shook his head, the hurt in his eyes palpable. "No, Rachel, I don't think I understand. I see it now. This isn't about the future, it's about control. You've been lying to me, twisting things to make me think I had to choose, but I see what this is now. It's all about what you want." The words stung, but Rachel refused to let them show. She couldn't afford to. "You don't get it," she spat, her voice rising. "I've been trying to protect you, and this is how you repay me, by siding with him." Drew's shoulders slumped. The weight of it all was starting to crush him. "I'm not siding with anyone, Rachel. I'm just seeing the truth. And the truth is, you've been using me. You've been using all of us. I can't ignore it anymore." Rachel recoiled as though he'd struck her, and for a moment the room was heavy with the silence between them. Drew had just taken the first step towards something irreversible. The trust was broken. Rachel saw it in his eyes. He was done. "Drew, don't walk away from me," she said, her voice shaking with the first real crack of vulnerability he'd ever heard from her. "Please, you can't turn your back on me. Not now." But Drew didn't respond. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes falling to the floor. "I'm sorry, Rachel, but I have to. I have to walk away from this." And just like that, Rachel's world shifted beneath her. The one person she had thought would always stand by her, her shield against Elliot's dominance, had turned away. Meanwhile, Elliot was on the other side of the house, sitting alone at his desk, his thoughts dark and heavy. He knew what was happening. He knew Drew was pulling away from Rachel, and though it should have felt like a victory, it didn't. The toll this had taken on his family was impossible to ignore. He hadn't just fought for control over his estate. He'd fought to preserve whatever was left of his family, and that was crumbling piece by piece. Drew came to him later that evening, his expression solemn, the weight of the day's conversation evident in his eyes. "Dad," Drew said quietly, "I don't know where to start." Elliot looked up at him, the sorrow in Drew's voice making something tighten in his chest. "You don't have to say anything, Drew. I know what you're going through. I can only imagine how hard this must be." Drew exhaled, sinking into the chair across from Elliot. "It's just, I didn't want to believe it, but I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep lying to myself." Elliot's heart ached for him, but he knew this was the only way forward, the only way to rebuild the fractured pieces of their relationship. Meanwhile, Rachel, now more desperate than ever, tried to salvage whatever shred of control she could. But her efforts were futile. Drew had seen through her. She had lost him. And no amount of pleading, no public display of victimhood could bring him back to her side. The family divide was now undeniable. And though Elliot felt a small sense of relief, of vindication, it was overshadowed by the emotional toll this had taken. Drew was still there, but the damage had been done. The family was shattered, and Elliot didn't know if it would ever be the same again. For the first time in weeks, Elliot thought about the future. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as the silence settled over the house, one thing became clear: Rachel was finished. And the only thing left to do was rebuild. The quiet in the house felt like a constant hum, a pressure that pressed against Elliot's chest every time he stepped into a room. Rachel, once the dominant force in the family, was now a ghost in the halls. Her absence had become the new normal, but it wasn't a peace he'd asked for. It was a peace that came at a cost. She was isolated now, no longer able to manipulate the situation or tea. Whist drew to her side. The power had shifted, and it was a bitter victory. Elliot watched Drew closely as he tried to adjust to the new reality. The emotional toll was visible on his son's face, lines of fatigue etched deeper with each passing day. Drew, once caught in the middle, was now slowly but surely leaning toward his father, seeking advice, asking questions he'd never thought to ask before. There was a new vulnerability in him, one that pained Elliot to witness. But as much as he wanted to protect Drew from the weight of it all, he knew this was the only way forward. They had to rebuild together. "I don't know what to do anymore, Dad," Drew admitted one evening, sitting across from Elliot at the kitchen table. His voice was raw, quieter than usual. "I thought I was doing the right thing, trying to keep everything together, but I've been so wrong." Elliot's heart tightened. He'd spent years trying to be the father Drew needed, even when it felt like Drew was slipping away. But this was different. Drew was finally seeing the truth. "You weren't wrong to want to keep the peace, son. You've always tried to protect this family," Elliot said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of their shared pain. "But sometimes protecting the peace means facing the hard truths, and you've done that." Drew looked at him, uncertainty clouding his eyes. "I'm not sure I can fix everything. I don't even know where to start." Elliot placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "One step at a time. We'll get through this together." But even as Elliot tried to reassure him, he could see the toll it was taking. Drew was no longer the boy who needed guidance. He was a man, struggling to reconcile the person he had been with the person he was becoming. The change was painful, but it was also inevitable. Meanwhile, Rachel, left alone and increasingly desperate, tried to cling to any shred of control. She made a few attempts to reach out to Drew, but they were half-hearted, driven more by desperation than genuine remorse. Her messages came at all hours, pleading for a second chance, asking him to remember the family they once were. But Drew didn't respond. He was starting to distance himself, emotionally withdrawing from her manipulations. Elliot knew Rachel was running out of options. Her usual tactics, her accusations, her emotional outbursts had lost their power. People had stopped listening to her. She couldn't manipulate the situation anymore, not without exposing herself further. The more she fought, the more she revealed her true nature, and the more isolated she became. Drew's distancing from Rachel became more pronounced with each passing day. He no longer seemed torn between them. Instead, he began to open up to Elliot, sharing his thoughts and fears, the heavy burden of guilt he carried for not seeing Rachel's manipulations sooner. But even as Drew admitted it to himself, it didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. Finally, one evening, Drew sat down with Elliot, his face grim. "I should have seen it. I should have known, but I didn't. Rachel, she was using me all along, was she?" Elliot felt a pang of sorrow for his son, but there was something else there too: relief. Drew had finally seen the truth, and that was the first step toward healing. "You weren't the one using her, Drew," Elliot said softly. "But now you've got a chance to rebuild what really matters." The silence that followed wasn't filled with anger or bitterness, but a quiet understanding between father and son. The path forward wouldn't be easy. There were too many wounds to heal, too much damage done. But for the first time, Elliot felt like they might actually have a chance to heal together. As the days stretched on, Elliot knew the hardest part was still to come. Rachel might be quiet now, but she wouldn't stay down forever. The war between them wasn't over, not by a long shot. The day Rachel requested the meeting, Elliot knew it was coming. The calm before the storm never lasted long with her. She had lost the legal battle, her public image tarnished, and with Drew's support now wavering, she had nothing left to hold on to except for this last-ditch attempt to regain control. Elliot sat in the study, waiting, his posture unwavering, his mind clear. He had no intention of giving ground, not this time. The air was thick with anticipation as the door opened and Rachel stepped in. She looked every bit the person she had become, tired, worn out, but with that same sharp edge to her demeanor. "Elliot," she began, her voice clipped, "you've ruined everything. Do you realize that?" Her eyes flashed with anger as she paced in front of him. "You've destroyed our family, everything I worked for. Drew, he doesn't even see what you've done to us." Elliot didn't flinch. He had heard it all before, the accusations, the guilt trips. But this time something was different. Rachel's words, meant to strike, felt hollow. She wasn't just fighting for control anymore. She was fighting for relevance, for a place in Drew's life that she was rapidly losing. "I'm not the one who ruined this, Rachel," Elliot replied, his voice calm, controlled. He met her gaze with steady resolve. "I'm simply protecting my legacy. I've spent my entire life building something, and I have every right to make decisions for myself. You don't get to control everything just because you've manipulated my son into thinking you're the victim." Rachel's face twisted with frustration. "You're selfish," she spat. "This was never about the estate or the legacy. It was about power, about making Drew choose between you and me. You knew what you were doing and you did it anyway." Elliot's anger flickered beneath the surface, but he kept his composure. "I'm not playing games, Rachel. This was never about forcing Drew to choose. This was about protecting what's mine and making sure he saw you for what you truly are." Rachel's eyes flashed, a hint of desperation creeping in. She turned to Drew, who had been standing quietly by the door, watching the scene unfold. The tension between them was thick, but it wasn't just about her and Elliot anymore. It was about Drew's loyalty, about his ability to see through the manipulations that had entangled him for so long. "Drew, please," Rachel pleaded, her voice cracking. "You can't let him do this. He's taking everything from us. You've always been my support, my partner. Don't let him pull you away from me." Drew stood frozen, his expression hard to read. He had been silent until now, his internal struggle evident. But something had shifted in him. The fog of manipulation was lifting. "I can't, Rachel," Drew said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I can't support you anymore. I've seen what you've done. How you've twisted everything to get what you want. It's not right. I'm choosing to repair my relationship with Dad. You've made it impossible to keep pretending." Rachel's face contorted with disbelief and fury. "You're abandoning me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "After everything I've done for you." Drew didn't respond. He didn't need to. The decision had been made. Without another word, Rachel turned and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, leaving an empty silence in her wake. Elliot and Drew stood in the aftermath, the tension between them palpable. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Drew looked at his father, his face softened with the weight of the decision he had just made. "I'm sorry, Dad," he murmured, his voice laced with guilt. "For everything. I should have seen it sooner." Elliot stepped forward, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. "You don't have to apologize. It's not your fault. We're going to rebuild, together." As they stood there, the house suddenly felt quieter. The battle wasn't over. Rachel would keep fighting in whatever way she could. But for the first time in months, Elliot felt a quiet sense of peace. They had taken a step toward healing. And while the future was uncertain, one thing was clear: they were finally on the same side. But as Elliot looked toward the door, he knew that Rachel wasn't going to let go so easily. The war wasn't over. The aftermath of the confrontation left the house feeling like a battleground that had gone quiet too soon. The air was thick with unspoken words, the echoes of Rachel's departure hanging like a dark cloud. Drew sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug, but the warmth of the coffee did nothing to ease the tension in his shoulders. He couldn't stop replaying the look on Rachel's face as she stormed out, the raw pain in her eyes still fresh in his memory. But there was something else now, something more painful. As the dust settled, he couldn't ignore the way he'd been manipulated, how easily he'd been swayed by Rachel's words, her promises. How could I have let it go on for so long? The thought plagued him, a constant gnawing at the back of his mind. He was no longer sure who he had been fighting for, his family, or the lie that had been fed to him for years. Elliot sat across from him, quieter than usual, watching his son as if trying to figure out the man he was becoming. The space between them was both a relief and a wound. Drew's eyes avoided his father's, unsure of how to bridge the gap, unsure of how to rebuild what had been broken. "I'm sorry, Dad," Drew muttered after a long silence, the words sounding heavier than they should. "For everything." Elliot exhaled slowly, his gaze softening. "You don't have to apologize for that, son," he said quietly. "We've all been caught in this. It's not just your fault." But Drew wasn't so sure. He had been the one who had let Rachel pull him into her web, the one who had allowed his father to be pushed away, bit by bit, until it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. And now, in the quiet aftermath of the chaos, Dr. Yeo didn't know where to begin picking up the pieces. Elliot could sense the emotional weight on his son, but he didn't know how to fix it. He had won the battle for control over his life, but the emotional cost was harder to bear than he had anticipated. Each moment of victory was stained with guilt. He had fought for his legacy, for his autonomy, but now, standing face to face with Drew, he saw the toll it had taken. His son was hurting, and Elliot wasn't sure how to heal it. Vanessa, ever the voice of reason, called that evening. "You need to give him time," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I know you're relieved to have regained control, but this is a process. Drew's been through a lot. He needs patience from you and from himself." Elliot nodded, though her words hit him like a cold wave. He knew she was right. Time. That's what they both needed. Time to rebuild, time to repair what had been shattered. But Drew wasn't sure he could give himself that time. He didn't know how to let go of the past, how to move forward when he kept questioning his choices. How had he let Rachel manipulate him for so long? How had he missed the signs? Rachel, meanwhile, had retreated into herself, growing more isolated by the day. The walls she'd built to control everyone around her were now her prison. With no one left to turn to, her anger began to fester. She was alone, cut off from Drew, cut off from the family, and there was nothing left to do but plot her next move. But even she knew it was too late. The family had moved on. Elliot and Drew were starting to rebuild their relationship, and no matter how many games Rachel played, she could no longer tear them apart. As the days passed, Drew found himself standing at a crossroads. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain: he couldn't keep living in the shadows of the past. There was no going back, no undoing the mistakes, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Elliot, too, felt the weight of what had been lost. He had fought to regain control, but the cost had been far greater than he expected. And as the quiet settled over the house once more, both father and son knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with its own challenges. But it was a road they would walk together. Or at least that's what they hoped. Rachel had retreated to the corners of her mind, isolated and bitter, nursing her wounds in the silence she had once used as a weapon. For days, she hadn't left her home, hadn't spoken to anyone except for a few terse phone calls with her lawyer. The weight of her defeat hung over her like a suffocating cloud. The power she had fought so hard for, the control she had tried to seize from Elliot, was slipping through her fingers irretrievably. Then on a cold morning, a letter arrived at Elliot's house. The envelope was thick, formal, and carried Rachel's name scrawled in sharp, demanding handwriting. As Elliot tore it open, he already knew what it would say, a final attempt to force his hand. Rachel was asking, no, demanding, that the will be changed to reflect her rights to the family estate. She wasn't going down without one last fight. Elliot read the letter once, then again, each word a bitter reminder of the lengths Rachel was willing to go. But his reaction was quiet, controlled. He placed the letter back down on the table without a second glance. He didn't need to engage with her anymore. The legal system had already sided with him, and Rachel no longer had the power to manipulate the situation. This was her final move, a last grasp at a power she had already lost. "Not this time," Elliot muttered to himself, a sense of finality settling in his chest. He knew the court had already made its ruling, and no amount of pleading, no last-minute demands would change that. Rachel had no more cards to play. Drew, who had been standing by the window watching the quiet morning unfold, turned around when he heard his father's voice. "What's going on?" Elliot handed him the letter, his expression unreadable. "Rachel's asking for the will to be changed. She's trying to claw back what she lost." Drew took the letter, his fingers trembling slightly. As he read the words, something inside him hardened. The realization that Rachel hadn't just been manipulating him, but had been doing it all along to get everything she wanted, finally sank in. He looked up at his father, a flicker of anger in his eyes. "I'm not going to entertain this," Drew said, his voice firm, the resolution clear. "She's crossed the line, it's over." For a moment, father and son stood there, the silence between them comfortable, the tension from the past slowly dissipating. Drew had made his choice. There would be no more loyalty to Rachel. Just as they began to breathe a little easier, Elliot's phone buzzed. It was a text from Vanessa. She wanted to meet, and she had something important to say to Drew. Elliot glanced at his son, who gave a slight nod. Later that evening, Drew and Vanessa sat across from one another in the study. Vanessa's face was gentle, but her eyes held a depth of understanding. "Drew," she began quietly, "there's something you need to know about Rachel. I don't think she ever meant for things to get this far, but her fear of losing control, it's always been her driving force." Drew's brows furrowed. "What do you mean? She's always been manipulative, controlling." Vanessa nodded. "Yes, but it's more than that. Rachel's whole life has been about keeping people close enough to control, but not so close that they could hurt her. She was never able to trust anyone, not even you, Drew. She saw every relationship as a potential threat to her dominance. That's why she did what she did. She couldn't stand the thought of losing what she thought was hers." Drew sat back, his mind racing. All the pieces that had never quite fit before suddenly fell into place. The emotional manipulation, the guilt trips, the constant playing of victim, it all stemmed from a fear of losing control. Rachel had never cared about family, only about power. Drew had been nothing more than a pawn in her game. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, but with it came clarity. He wasn't the one at fault. He had been deceived, just like his father. And now, the power Rachel had held over him, over them both, was gone. By the time Drew walked back into the living room, it was clear. Rachel had lost. The letters, the demands, they were just the final, desperate cries of a woman who had lost everything. Later, as the evening drew to a close, Drew and Elliot shared a quiet moment on the couch. Drew didn't speak at first, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. But after a long pause, he turned to his father, his voice softer now. "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have seen it sooner." Elliot looked at him, his eyes tired but warm. "It's all right, son. We'll get through this." It wasn't the end of the road, but it was a new beginning. Drew had chosen his side, and as father and son sat in silence, knowing the war wasn't truly over, they also knew something important had changed. They were no longer divided. They had each other, and for the first time in a long time, Elliot believed they might actually heal. But Rachel wasn't finished yet. Even in defeat, her mind churned with plans, and she wasn't about to vanish quietly into the night. The house felt emptier without Rachel. The constant hum of her presence, the sharp words, the passive-aggressive manipulations, had finally ceased. It was a strange quiet, a space left behind where a storm used to rage. And yet, for Elliot, the silence wasn't entirely peaceful. The absence of the chaos Rachel brought only magnified the quiet rift between him and Drew. The last few months had shattered everything, but it had also forced them to confront what was left. And what was left, though battered and fragile, was the chance to rebuild. Drew had started to take on more responsibility in the family business, stepping up in ways Elliot hadn't expected. There were decisions Drew was making now, calls he was handling, things Elliot once feared letting go of. It wasn't just about the business. It was about Drew showing his father that he was ready to step into the role he had long shied away from. He was no longer the passive bystander he once was, and though Elliot felt a flicker of pride, there was also a lingering hesitation. Elliot stood in the doorway of the office one afternoon, watching Drew finalize some paperwork. His son had always been capable, but the question lingered in his mind. Was he truly ready? Or was he still carrying the weight of Rachel's influence? "You're doing good, Drew," Elliot said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than he intended. Drew looked up from the papers, his face tense, but there was a glint of something else in his eyes, an unspoken understanding, a step toward something new. "I want to be better," Drew replied, his voice steady. "I want to prove I can do this." It was a moment of raw honesty, one Elliot hadn't seen in Drew before. For so long, Drew had been stuck between two worlds, caught between his loyalty to Rachel and the love he had for his father. The realization that he had to choose, that he had to step into the role of the man he was meant to be, hadn't come easy. "I'm proud of you," Elliot said, though his words felt heavy. He could see Drew growing into his own, but there was still a gap between them, still a part of Elliot that wanted to hold on to the way things used to be. The part that feared letting go of control. Drew shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know how to say this, but I've always felt like I was stuck, like I had to choose between you and her." He swallowed, his gaze faltering as if admitting it was too painful. "I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping the peace, but now I see. I see what I've let slip away." Elliot's chest tightened. He had known it, of course, but hearing Drew say it out loud, it stung. All the years he had spent focused on building his empire, on keeping his family intact at any cost, had pushed Drew away. He hadn't seen it until now, hadn't realized how his obsession with control had cast a shadow over everything. "I'm sorry," Elliot said softly. The words felt too small, too insignificant to make up for the years lost, but they were all he had. Drew nodded, the weight of their past still hanging between them. "I don't blame you. I just wish things had been different. I wish I'd seen it sooner." Elliot stepped closer, his eyes meeting Drew's. "It's never too late. We've got time to make it right, Drew, one step at a time." The silence that followed was heavier than words. There was so much still left unsaid, so much healing to be done. But for the first time in a long time, Elliot felt something shift, something that made the future feel a little less uncertain. Despite the lingering tension between them, they both understood that healing would take time. But they were finally on the right path, both of them. And that small step, that quiet moment of acknowledgement, was the beginning of something new. But even as they moved forward, the shadows of their past still loomed over them. It wasn't over, not yet. The mornings were quieter now, a stark contrast to the chaos that had once filled the house. Drew and Elliot had begun spending more time together, almost as if they were trying to relearn what it meant to be a family. They started small, fishing trips to the lake, something they used to do when Drew was younger. It wasn't just about the fishing. It was about reconnecting, sharing space without the weight of old grudges or unspoken words hanging over them. Elliot felt the change in himself. For years, he had been consumed by the need to control everything, his business, his legacy, and even his son's future. But now, as they sat side by side on the small boat, the gentle sway of the water beneath them, Elliot realized how much he had missed this. He had spent so much time trying to protect Drew from the world that he'd forgotten to trust him, to let him grow. The realization was painful, and it lingered in the back of his mind, but there was no turning back now. Drew, too, was beginning to see his father differently. The man who had always seemed so rigid, so focused on his empire, was starting to show sides of himself Drew had never noticed. He saw the vulnerability in Elliot's eyes now, the cracks that had formed in the walls of control he'd built around himself. Drew had spent so much of his life feeling like his father's expectations were a burden, but now he was beginning to understand. The things Elliot had done, though flawed, even misguided, had always been rooted in care. "Dad," Drew said quietly one afternoon as they sat together, rods in hand, "I never really understood why you pushed me so hard. I thought it was just about the business, about you wanting me to follow in your footsteps." Elliot didn't look at him right away, but the way his fingers gripped the fishing pole told Drew that the words had hit their mark. Slowly, Elliot met his son's gaze, his face a mixture of regret and something else, maybe relief. "It wasn't just about the business, Drew. I wanted to protect you. I thought if I kept you close, kept you in line, you wouldn't make the mistakes I did. I wanted to make sure you had everything I never had." Drew's chest tightened, a mix of emotions he hadn't expected bubbling up. He hadn't realized how much his father's actions had been motivated by fear of losing him, of losing control. But hearing it from Elliot, hearing the truth in his father's voice, made something in Drew shift. The days and weeks that followed weren't easy. They attend ed therapy together, slowly working through the mess they had created. It wasn't some miraculous breakthrough. The process was slow, painful at times, but Drew started to see the changes. They both did. Trust, once so fragile between them, was beginning to rebuild. It was a fragile thing, trust, but it was theirs to mend now, one conversation, one small step at a time. Vanessa continued to offer her steady guidance, speaking to Drew when he grew frustrated, reminding him that the scars of the past couldn't be erased in a moment. Patience, she told him. Healing takes time. You both need it. You've come a long way already. Drew wasn't so sure. There were still moments when the weight of the past threatened to pull him back into old patterns, but he could feel it, the change in himself, in Elliot. The way his father, once so set in his ways, was allowing him more room, more responsibility. It wasn't easy for either of them, but it was real. They were starting to let go of the roles they'd played for so long, father, son, boss, and subordinate, and finding something new. Elliot, too, felt the tug of vulnerability, the push and pull of wanting to control and wanting to let go. But he was learning, just like Drew, that control didn't mean protection. It meant distance. And the thing he had feared most, that Drew would slip away, was actually happening, but in a way he hadn't expected. Drew was stepping up, stepping into his own life, and that was something Elliot had to trust. And so, one small step at a time, they moved forward, knowing it wouldn't be quick or easy. But there was hope in the air now, something they hadn't had before. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, but for the first time in years, Elliot and Drew were finally on the same path. And that was a victory in itself. But as they continued their journey together, the question lingered. How long could they keep moving forward before the past threatened to pull them back again? It was an ordinary afternoon, or so it seemed. Elliot had been sitting in his study, reviewing some paperwork, when Drew walked in, carrying a thick folder in his hands. There was a confidence in his stride that Elliot hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just the way he walked, it was the way he held himself, like he was no longer just his father's son, but a man with his own purpose. "Dad," Drew began, setting the folder on the desk, "I've been going over the new project proposal, the one for the new development. I think we need to move forward with it now, no more waiting. We can't afford to stall. I've got the numbers, the contacts, and the plan." Elliot blinked, caught off guard by his son's assertiveness. "Drew, are you sure?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, a knee-jerk response from years of controlling every move, every decision. He didn't want to let go, not yet. Drew didn't hesitate. He laid the folder down on the desk, his voice calm but unwavering. "Yes, I'm sure. I've been watching, studying, and I think it's time. I've been part of this business long enough. I know what I'm doing, Dad." A lump formed in Elliot's throat. He was proud, deeply proud, but there was a part of him that recoiled at the thought of releasing his grip on something he'd built from the ground up. Could Drew really handle it? He hadn't been ready to let go, but looking at his son, standing there, confident and sure, he realized Drew had earned this. "I trust you," Elliot said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't easy to admit, but it was the truth. There was no more pretending. He had to let go, and for the first time he felt himself doing it willingly. But just as the words left his mouth, a message notification pinged on Elliot's phone. He picked it up and saw Rachel's name. His stomach twisted. She had been silent for weeks, a sharp contrast to her usual desperate attempts to involve herself. But now, out of nowhere, she had sent a message through a mutual acquaintance. It was a thinly veiled attempt to insert herself into their lives again, demanding attention, demanding action. Drew saw his father's reaction and knew instantly what it was. He'd been expecting it. "I'll handle it," Drew said, taking a breath. He grabbed his phone, typing quickly, his fingers moving decisively. After a moment, he looked at his father, his eyes hardening. "She has no place in our lives anymore. I won't let her drag us back." The finality in his voice made Elliot's chest tighten. This was his son, standing firm, showing the strength he had always hoped for. Rachel's grip on their family was finally broken, and Drew was the one who had severed it. Drew's confidence was growing by the day. He was stepping into his role, not just as the heir to the business, but as a leader in his own right. And for the first time, Elliot saw it, saw the potential in Drew that had been obscured by years of uncertainty and manipulation. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about their family. This was about their future. "Drew," Elliot began, his voice softer now, filled with something he hadn't expected to feel: peace. "I think it's time. You lead this project. I'm stepping back." Drew met his father's gaze, his face a mixture of surprise and determination. "Thanks, Dad. I won't let you down." As they stood there, a weight lifted from Elliot's shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt a genuine peace about the future of the business and about the future of his family. They were on a new path now, one that was built on trust and mutual respect. And as they made plans for the project, the foundation of their relationship began to shift. Drew, acknowledging his father's past mistakes, extended forgiveness without hesitation, a quiet act of grace that sealed the new chapter of their bond. Together, they were ready to face the future, side by side. But as Drew took the reins and moved forward, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead, though brighter, would not be without its challenges. How would they navigate the business now that the roles had changed? Only time would tell. The final legal battle had dragged on longer than Elliot had ever expected. His mind had been consumed with the looming question: would this ever end? It seemed like Rachel would never let go. But now, in her last-ditch attempt to reclaim what she had lost, she was doing the unthinkable, taking him to court for a portion of the estate. Her claim was absurd. She demanded compensation for the years she had sacrificed in the name of the family. The very idea made Elliot's blood run cold. Her audacity was staggering. She was attempting to manipulate the courts, painting herself as the victim, while she had spent years manipulating everyone around her to gain control. Rachel had never truly cared about sacrifice. It had always been about power. But now, as she stood in the courtroom trying to win over the judge, her story was falling apart. Drew had already made his choice, and there was no turning back. He was fully aligned with his father now, standing with Elliot, unshaken, determined. He had spent enough time in the shadows of Rachel's influence to know how toxic her lies were. Watching his mother twist the truth one last time had solidified his decision. He wasn't going to back down. "Dad, we're in this together," Drew said, his voice unwavering as he sat beside Elliot in the courtroom. The weight of those words, "we're in this together," carried more than just support. They were a promise, a declaration of loyalty that meant everything to Elliot. Rachel, still defiant, shot them both a venomous look. She wasn't done, not yet. But as the days wore on, her case began to crumble. The lies she had fed everyone, her version of the story, her manipulation of Drew, her false martyrdom, were slowly being exposed. Max, Elliot's lawyer, tore apart Rachel's claims, dissecting each fabricated detail with precision, turning the court's attention to her consistent pattern of deceit. The more Rachel fought, the clearer it became. She had no ground to stand on. In one pivotal moment, Rachel's own past actions, her attempts to undermine Elliot's authority, her manipulation of Drew, and her repeated attempts to seize control, were brought into the light. The judge, once skeptical, began to see through Rachel's thinly veiled tactics. Her desperation only made things worse. It was no longer just a battle for control over the estate. It was a battle for her very credibility. The final blow came when the court ruled in Elliot's favor, dismissing Rachel's claims outright. But the victory wasn't just legal, it was personal. Rachel was ordered to pay court fees, a symbolic and financial blow that further isolated her from any future influence over the family. It was the end of her attempt to regain control. And as the verdict was read aloud, Elliot felt a weight lift from his chest. But it wasn't just the victory that mattered. It was Drew. As the case came to a close, Elliot glanced at his son, who sat beside him, shoulders squared, face calm. The years of manipulation were behind them now. Drew had stood by his father, unwavering through the hardest test of their relationship. They had emerged stronger, more united. Rachel's hold was finally broken, and for the first time, Elliot could feel the closure he had been desperately searching for. "We did it," Drew said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. Elliot nodded, though the victory didn't feel as sweet as he'd imagined. There was a part of him that felt relief, but another part, one that had lived through the constant battle with Rachel, still wondered if the scars would ever truly fade. Had they truly won? Or was this just the beginning of something else? As they walked out of the courtroom together, Elliot knew that, despite the legal victory, there was still much to rebuild. But one thing was certain: they were done with Rachel. She had lost, and her influence over their lives had ended. Now the future was theirs to reclaim, but the question lingered: could they truly move on? Or would Rachel find a way to haunt them one last time? The clink of silverware against plates was the only sound that filled the room, a stark contrast to the tense silence that had once defined their dinners. The legal battles were over now, and as the final remnants of conflict faded into the past, Elliot and Drew found themselves seated at the same table once again. It wasn't perfect. There was still an undercurrent of unfinished business between them, but the heaviness of the past few months had lightened, replaced by a quiet understanding that things had changed. Drew looked across the table, his expression thoughtful. He hadn't been the same since the battle with Rachel had ended. Something inside him had shifted. He wasn't the passive son who had once been caught between loyalty and fear. He was different now, stronger. "You know, Dad," Drew began, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity, "I never realized how much I needed to go through all of this to really understand what's important. I've changed. A lot. And I couldn't have done it without you." Elliot paused, the weight of Drew's words settling over him. It was hard to admit, but Drew's growth was something Elliot hadn't been able to fully see until now. There was still so much between them, so much history, but hearing his son speak like this, with such clarity and maturity, made him believe in the possibility of moving forward. Drew was finally stepping into the man Elliot had always hoped he could be, but never knew how to guide him toward. "I'm proud of you," Elliot said quietly, the words feeling like they held more weight than they ever had before. But it wasn't just pride. It was something deeper, a sense of relief that Drew had found his path, even if it had been a long and painful journey to get there. Drew's eyes softened. "I know I haven't always been the son you needed," he said, his voice heavy with the years of distance and misunderstanding between them. "But I want to make things right. I'm ready to take on more. In the business, in this family, I'm ready." Elliot felt a lump form in his throat. The weight of the past, the mistakes, the missed opportunities, was still there, but so was the hope. The hope that this could be the beginning of something better, something that was built on the lessons learned from everything they had been through. "I've made my share of mistakes too, Drew," Elliot said, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "I pushed you too hard, tried to control things I couldn't, but I realize now that I don't need to. I don't want to. I want to rebuild us on a foundation of trust. I'm done with the power games. It's about respect now." Drew nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful as he processed his father's words. The tension that had once existed between them was slowly dissolving, but it wasn't gone entirely. There were still scars, still wounds that would need time to heal, but they were taking the first steps. From across the room, Vanessa watched the exchange between father and son, her gaze softening. She had seen them struggle, seen them fight through the chaos, but now there was something different. She had always known that their relationship had the potential to heal, but she also knew it would take time. She had offered Drew guidance, urged him to be patient with his father, and now she could see the first signs of that patience paying off. The evening drew to a close, but Drew and Elliot didn't hurry to leave. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence that spoke of understanding, of two men finally seeing each other for who they were, without the weight of old expectations. "You know," Elliot said, after a long pause, "I'm looking forward to seeing what you'll do with the business. But more than that, I'm looking forward to seeing what we'll do next, together." Drew smiled, his face lighter than it had been in a long time. "Me too, Dad, me too." As they sat together, the bond between them began to solidify in a way that felt real, solid, but still evolving. They were no longer just father and son, but two people who had weathered a storm and were now building something new, something stronger. The future wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time in a long while, Elliot felt like it was something they could face together. But as they sat there, the quiet victory of the evening hanging in the air, a nagging thought crept into Elliot's mind. Had they truly left everything behind? Or was there still a lingering shadow waiting to reappear? The sun set gently over the estate, casting long shadows across the yard, but there was warmth in the air, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there in months. With the weight of the legal battles finally behind them, Elliot, Drew, and Vanessa gathered together, sitting around the family table for the first time in what felt like ages. The tension that had once choked the air between them was gone, replaced with a tentative hope that had begun to grow, quiet but steady. Drew leaned back in his chair, his gaze focused on the future. There were no more battles to fight, no more accusations to defend against. What mattered now was moving forward together. "Dad, I've been thinking. We've got a real opportunity here, not just with the business, but with everything we've been through. We can build something new, something that's truly ours." Elliot nodded, feeling the weight of his son's words sink in. The future had always seemed so uncertain, so clouded by the past, but now the fog was clearing. He looked at Drew, who had grown into the man he always hoped he could be, and a sense of pride filled him. Drew wasn't just taking over the reins, he was helping to build a new foundation, one that was stronger, more resilient. "I agree," Elliot said, his voice steady. "Let's start fresh. New ventures, new goals. But this time we do it on our terms. No more secrets, no more manipulation." Vanessa, who had been quietly listening, smiled gently, but there was a cautious edge to her expression. "I think it's a great idea," she said, her voice full of support but laced with a warning. "But remember, you've both been through a lot. It's going to take time. Don't rush it. The scars are still there, but you're getting somewhere. Don't forget to keep working on this, your relationship. It's just as important as any business plan you make." Drew and Elliot exchanged a look, a wordless understanding passing between them. Vanessa was right. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. The emotional wounds from the past were still there, scars that wouldn't fade overnight. But they had made it through the worst of it, together. And that was enough to move forward. As they discussed plans for new family ventures and the direction they wanted to take, there was a palpable sense of unity. Rachel's absence was a void in many ways. Her manipulations had left deep marks, but the family wasn't consumed by it anymore. Drew and Elliot were moving forward, and that was enough to heal the past. For the first time in a long time, Elliot felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. He looked at Drew, watching his son step up, not just as his successor, but as a partner in a way he had never imagined. They were building something solid, not just for themselves, but for the future, for their family. "I'm proud of you, Drew," Elliot said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything you've done, for everything you're doing." Drew smiled, his eyes bright with a new sense of purpose. "We're in this together, Dad, always." But as the evening wore on, a quiet thought lingered in Elliot's mind. They were stronger, yes. They had rebuilt their bond. But had they truly left everything behind? Could they really move on without looking back? Rachel was gone, but her shadow still loomed, a reminder of how fragile everything was. They were united now, but the future was still uncertain. And with it, the question that remained: would the past truly stay buried, or would it rise again when they least expected it? The first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows of the estate as Drew and Elliot stood together, reviewing plans for their next big business venture. It felt like a new era had dawned, not just for the family, but for their entire future. The weight of Rachel's absence was still present, but it no longer felt like a heavy burden pressing down on them. She was gone, but her influence no longer had the power to shape their decisions. For the first time in years, they could breathe, knowing they were free from the constant manipulation that had once clouded their every move. Drew was no longer just the son following his father's lead. He was stepping up, taking on more responsibility within the business. The confidence that had once eluded him now radiated from him in every decision he made. It wasn't just about the numbers on a page or the deals to be closed. Drew was now the driving force, helping shape the direction of their future. Elliot watched his son with a sense of pride that was hard to articulate. Drew was no longer the passive, uncertain man he had once been. He was growing into the leader Elliot had always hoped he could be, though it still felt strange for Elliot to take a backseat. It wasn't about control anymore, though. It couldn't be. As much as it hurt to admit, Elliot knew Drew needed room to lead, and he was willing to give it to him, even if it meant stepping away from the reins he had held for so long. "I'm with you, son," Elliot said quietly, his voice steady but filled with a depth of feeling he hadn't realized was there. "I'm proud of what you're doing. You've earned this." Drew looked at his father, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thanks, Dad, but this is us. We're in this together." They'd both come so far, and yet as plans for their new venture unfolded, it was clear that their relationship had also changed. There was a mutual respect now, an understanding that had taken years to develop. No longer was Elliot focused on controlling every aspect of Drew's life. No longer was Drew weighed down by the need to appease his father. Together, they were building something new, a future they could both be proud of. Their first step together came soon after, a trip to another city to discuss a potential partnership. The business venture was the kind of project that could reshape everything for the family, and as father and son boarded the plane together, the weight of the journey ahead felt lighter than it ever had before. They were no longer just doing it for the legacy. They were doing it for themselves. Samantha, always perceptive, knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. She had seen the struggles, the raw emotion, and the healing that had yet to come. But as she watched Drew and Elliot move forward, she felt confident. "You've both come so far," she told them during a quiet conversation. "But remember, the healing doesn't end with Rachel's departure. It's a long road. Just don't rush it." Drew nodded, understanding. The healing had only just begun, but it was happening piece by piece, and that was what mattered. As the days passed, the family began to grow closer, not just in business but in life. They were embracing change, adapting to the new dynamic, and learning how to function as a unit without the shadows of the past. Bonds were being formed, stronger, more genuine connections that were born from mutual respect, not manipulation. One night as they sat together on the balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Drew and Elliot shared a quiet moment. No words were needed. They had come to an unspoken understanding. Their relationship had evolved from one of control and resentment to one built on trust and respect. Elliot finally broke the silence, his voice soft but resolute. "We've still got a long way to go, Drew, but we're on the right path, together." Drew looked at his father, a steady, sure gaze that reflected everything they had been through and everything they would face ahead. "Yeah, we are." The future wasn't guaranteed. There would always be challenges ahead, new ventures, more obstacles, and the constant weight of the unknown. But for the first time in years, Elliot and Drew felt ready. They weren't just facing the future, they were shaping it, together. As they sat in the quiet stillness, the uncertainty of what lay ahead remained, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an opportunity. But as they turned toward the future, a quiet question lingered in Elliot's mind. Was the past truly behind them, or would it eventually catch up with them in ways they couldn't predict? Elliot and Drew sat together in the study, the familiar warmth of the room surrounding them, but it felt different now. The chaos that had once clouded their lives, the tension between father and son, had been replaced by something far more solid, a bond that had taken years to rebuild. They had both been through hell, tested by betrayal, fear, and doubt, but in the end they had emerged from the other side, together. "I never thought we'd get here," Drew said quietly, his fingers tracing the edge of his father's desk. His voice was steady, but there was a weight to it, a weight of reflection. "Everything we've been through, it's changed us, changed me. I didn't realize how much I was letting fear drive my decisions. I didn't see how much you were trying to protect me." Elliot nodded, his gaze softening as he leaned back in his chair. "I was trying to control everything, Drew. I was afraid of losing you, of losing control of the family and everything I worked for. I didn't see how much that was pushing you away." The silence between them was heavy with understanding, the past finally giving way to something that felt like peace. The battles were over. Rachel was a distant memory, her manipulation no longer a threat. For the first time in years, Elliot could look at his son and see someone who was truly ready to stand by his side. No longer a pawn in someone else's game, but an equal, someone who could lead and guide the business with integrity. "We've got a chance now, Dad," Drew said, his voice gaining strength. "A real chance to build something that's ours, something we can both be proud of. And it's not just about the business, it's about us, about the family." Elliot felt a surge of pride in his chest. Drew was right. They were more than just a father and son trying to make a living. They had built something together, something rooted in trust, not control. And it was a foundation strong enough to support whatever came next. "We can grow, Drew," Elliot said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll expand the business, build something bigger, and this time we do it together. No more hiding, no more pretending. This is our future, yours and mine." As they talked, the weight of the past, of Rachel's betrayal, of all the years of strain seemed to lift. The path ahead was clearer, not because it would be easy, but because they had learned what it meant to trust each other. They had learned what it meant to be family again. From the sidelines, Vanessa watched, quietly observing the progress they had made. She knew there was still work to be done, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. She had seen Drew struggle, had seen the tension between them that once seemed insurmountable, and now she saw the quiet growth. The quiet understanding that had formed between father and son. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. As Drew stood up to leave, he paused and looked back at his father. "You know, Dad, I've learned a lot through all of this. About you, about me. But most of all, I've learned what it means to have trust. And I think that's the biggest thing we've gained through all of this." Elliot smiled, his gaze steady. "We've come a long way, son, and there's still a long road ahead of us, but I'm ready for it, with you by my side." As they walked out of the study together, the weight of the past seemed a distant memory. Ahead of them lay a new chapter, one that would come with its own challenges, no doubt. But they were no longer bound by the past, no longer weighed down by Rachel's manipulations or the mistakes they had made. They had built something real, and with trust as their foundation, Elliot and Drew knew they were ready to face whatever came next.